The year was 1878. The month was May. Abigail felt the heat of the sun on the back of her neck, a steady, indifferent pressure. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rough corner of a burlap sack. Beside her, her twin sister Martha stood still as a fence post, her gaze fixed on the shimmering line of the horizon, refusing to grant the man in front of them the attention he demanded. The air tasted of dust and horses. The sun did not care. The baked earth did not care. The town's most successful farmer, Mr. Pritchard, gestured with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the hastily constructed wooden coops. Inside, 63 chickens milled about in confused, silent circles. They were all blind. He adjusted the brim of his hat, casting a shadow that did little to cool the contempt in his voice. "You've bought yourselves 63 mouths that can't even find their own feed," he said, the words falling like hard, dry clods of dirt. "You've paid for your own ruin." He turned and walked away, his judgment delivered, leaving the two sisters alone in the silence of the town square. But in a small journal Martha carried, bound in worn leather, was a drawing that would change everything. A simple sketch of a beetle, and next to it, the sharp, curved beak of a chicken. We will look at that drawing in a moment. First, let us know in the comments where you are watching from in the world. Abigail and Martha were not born to this valley. They had arrived as children, orphans delivered by the parish cart after a fever had swept through their home district, leaving them with nothing but each other and the clothes on their backs. They were taken in by the church, which meant they were passed around from farm to farm, a pair of quiet, interchangeable hands to mend fences, pull weeds, and haul water. They were fed and sheltered in exchange for labor. It was a bargain the world considered fair. But the sisters were different. They did not just work, they watched. They possessed a shared, silent curiosity that the farmers they worked for found unsettling. While other hands were content to follow orders, Abigail and Martha were students of the land itself. They noticed things. They saw that the corn grew tallest where the morning glories were thickest, and that the squash plants were always healthier when marigolds were planted nearby. They learned to read the sky not just for rain, but for the subtle shifts in humidity that foretold a pestilent wind. In the evenings, when their bodies ached and they should have been sleeping, they would light a single tallow candle. By its flickering, greasy light, they would read from the few agricultural pamphlets they had managed to buy with coins saved from mending clothes for the minister's wife. They read about soil composition, crop rotation, and the strange, symbiotic relationships between plants and insects. They filled their leather-bound journal not with diary entries, but with data. Sketches of leaf blight. Notes on the water retention of sandy soil versus clay. Questions. Their questions made people uncomfortable. They were not rude questions, but they challenged the established order, the way things had always been done. Why do we burn the corn stalks instead of tilling them back into the soil? Martha once asked a farmer, who simply stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. What if we planted a cover crop of clover in the fall to hold the earth through the winter? Abigail had inquired of another, who told her not to trouble her head with men's work. Their curiosity was seen as a kind of arrogance. Their desire to understand was interpreted as a refusal to simply obey. The community did not have a category for young women like them. A woman's hands were for pulling, planting, and praying, not for writing and wondering. The rejection they felt was not a single, sharp act of cruelty. It was a systemic friction, the constant, grinding pressure of a world that had no room for their shape. The minister's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman who considered herself their benefactor, once summarized the town's position with crisp finality. A woman's place on a farm is to follow her husband's instruction, she had told them, her voice thin and certain, not to fill her head with useless questions from a book. They saved for 5 years. Every penny earned from extra work, every coin found on a dusty road, went into a small tin box buried beneath a loose floorboard in their attic room. When they finally had enough, they bought the one piece of land no one else wanted. 10 acres at the far edge of the valley, a patch of ground the old-timers called Pritchard's Folly because even he, the valley's most prosperous farmer, had failed to make it yield. The soil was sandy, the creek ran thin by midsummer, and it was exposed to the harshest of the western winds. To the town, it was proof of their foolishness. To Abigail and Martha, it was the first thing that had ever been entirely their own. It was on this land, their land, that they began to build their small vegetable farm. And it was here, a year later, that they made the decision that would seal their reputation as the valley's resident eccentrics. A traveling salesman, his wagon filled with all manner of oddities, had passed through with a strange cargo, a flock of chickens blinded by a coop disease. He was selling them for pennies on the dollar. While the town laughed, Abigail and Martha spent the last of their savings from their first meager harvest. They bought all 63. They were now proprietors of a failing piece of land and a flock of useless birds. They were utterly, finally, on their own. The first year on their own land was a lesson in the physics of survival. The primary antagonist was not a person, but the sun. It rose each morning not as a gentle promise, but as a hot, brassy disk that bleached the color from the sky and baked the moisture from the earth. Their 10 acres offered little shade. The work of turning the sandy, neglected soil was brutal. They used their bodies as machinery, and the fuel was bread, water, and sheer will. Their hands, accustomed to labor, were not prepared for this. The handles of the hoes and shovels wore through their calluses, raising blisters that filled with fluid, broke, and bled. They would wrap them in torn strips of cloth at night, but by morning the work would open the wounds again. The pain was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days. Water was the currency of their existence. The creek that bordered their property was wide but shallow, and as June bled into July, it shrank to a sluggish, muddy trickle. They dug a well, but their savings had been spent on the land and the chickens, so they could not afford to dig deep. The water they drew was barely enough for themselves and the chickens, let alone the thirsty rows of lettuce, cabbage, and carrots. Every morning and every evening, they hauled water in wooden buckets, their shoulders and backs screaming in protest. The weight of the water was the weight of their ambition. Some days, it felt impossibly heavy. The body began to fail in small, specific ways. Dizziness would come on suddenly in the midday heat, the world tilting and shimmering at the edges. They learned to recognize the signs, to drop to their knees and crawl to the shade of their small cabin before consciousness fled. Their teeth began to ache, a dull, persistent throb that had nothing to do with decay and everything to do with the constant, low-grade stress of dehydration and malnutrition. They grew thin, the angles of their faces becoming more pronounced, their identical calico dresses hanging loose on their frames. There were moments they considered giving up. One evening in late July, a hot wind blew for hours, a relentless, scouring force that picked up the fine topsoil and threw it against their cabin. It was not a storm, just a persistent, malevolent breath that frayed the nerves and dried the soul. When it finally died down at dusk, they stepped outside to survey the damage. A fine layer of grit covered everything, their struggling seedlings bent and abraded. Martha sat on the porch steps, the warm wood cool against her skin. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Her voice, when it came, was a ragged whisper. Maybe Mr. Pritchard was right, she did not need to finish the sentence. They both knew the words. Maybe we just paid for our own ruin. The thought was a tempting poison. They could sell the land for a pittance. They could go back to the way things were, to being hired hands on someone else's farm. They would be subject to the whims of others, but there would be food on the table. There would be no more of this crushing responsibility, this constant, gnawing fear of failure. Abigail stood beside her sister, silent, looking out at the grey, wind-scoured landscape. She felt the appeal of surrender, the seductive promise of an end to the struggle. She could feel the story of their farm ending right there, on that dusty porch. But a body that has been trained to work does not know how to be still for long. Abigail turned without a word and went back inside the cabin. She returned a moment later with their leather-bound journal and a lit candle. She sat down next to Martha and opened it. She did not turn to a page of encouraging words or a pressed flower. She turned to a diagram they had drawn weeks before, a plan for a simple irrigation system using hollowed-out gourds and a network of carefully placed trenches to capture every precious drop of morning dew and channel it to the roots of the plants. It was not a miracle. It was not a speech. It was a practical problem that demanded their immediate attention. The mind can despair, but the hands remember their purpose. The sight of the drawing, of their own careful thinking made visible on the page, was enough. It was a reminder that they were not just victims of the sun and the wind. They were thinkers. They were planners. Martha lifted her head, and in the flickering candlelight, they began to discuss where the first trench should go. The despair did not vanish, but it was pushed aside by the more immediate demands of the work. The discovery, when it came, was as quiet as everything else in their lives. It was not a sudden revelation but a slow, dawning awareness. It was about the chickens. They had built a large, movable pen for the flock, a simple construction of scavenged lumber and wire that they could shift from place to place. At first, they had kept the birds separate from their vegetable plots, fearing they would eat the seedlings. They fed them grain they could ill afford, just as Mr. Pritchard had predicted. But they watched the birds. Sighted chickens were frantic, noisy creatures, their movements jerky and unpredictable. They pecked at anything that glittered, chased anything that moved, and spent much of their energy in a state of high alert. Their blind chickens were different. Deprived of sight, their other senses had sharpened to a degree that was almost supernatural. They moved slowly, methodically. They were not pecking at the ground, they were reading it. One afternoon, Abigail sat in the shade, watching them. She saw a hen stop, tilt its head, and then tap the ground with its foot, like a musician tapping a drum. It tapped once, twice, then drove its beak into the earth with startling precision and pulled out a fat, white grub. It had not seen the grub. It had heard it. Or felt its vibration through the soil. The other birds were doing the same, using their feet and beaks as delicate instruments to probe and listen and smell. They were not foragers. They were auditors of the soil, conducting a meticulous, inch-by-inch survey of the subterranean world. A sighted bird would have ignored the grub, distracted by a fluttering leaf or a glint of sun on a piece of glass. These birds were focused. Their world was the soil beneath their feet, and they missed nothing. Abigail felt a profound sense of recognition. It was not relief, not the joy of a problem solved. It was the feeling of a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She looked over at Martha, who was watching from the other side of the pen. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a new understanding passed between them. They dropped to their knees on the dusty ground, not in prayer, but in silent, focused observation. They sat there for a long time, watching the blind chickens, and felt something for which they had no word. It felt like truth. The sisters began to build. Their new understanding of the chickens was not an endpoint, but a foundation. They did not have the money for new tools or lumber, so they made do with what the land and their own ingenuity provided. They dismantled an old, collapsed shed at the far end of their property, salvaging every nail and plank. With this wood, they constructed several low, movable fences. These were not meant to confine, but to guide. They called them their chicken tractors. The system was simple, born of their methodical observation. Each morning, they would move the fences to enclose a new section of their vegetable garden. They would then release the flock into this temporary pasture. The 63 blind chickens would descend upon the soil and begin their patient work. They moved with a calm, collective purpose, their feet tapping, their beaks probing. They consumed every cutworm, every grub, every beetle larva they could detect. Their sharp claws tilled the surface of the soil, breaking up the hard crust left by the sun. And as they worked, they fertilized the ground with their droppings. After a day, the sisters would move the fences to the next plot, leaving behind a patch of earth that was debugged, tilled, and enriched. It was a closed loop, a self-sustaining engine of cultivation powered by the very creatures the world had deemed useless. They improvised in other ways. They gathered the flat, sharp-edged pieces of shale that littered the creek bed, lashing them to sturdy branches with strips of rawhide to create effective, if crude, hose for weeding. They collected cracked pottery shards discarded by previous settlers, arranging them in the soil around the base of their plants to act as tiny, individual reservoirs, catching and holding the morning dew. From the tall reeds that grew along the water's edge, they wove intricate screens to provide their most delicate lettuce with a respite from the harshest afternoon sun. Their farm became a tapestry of salvaged, repurposed, and reimagined things. It was a place where nothing was wasted. Then the Beetles came. It began as a rumor, a worried murmur at the general store. A farmer on the eastern edge of the valley had found his potato plants covered in small, striped insects. Within a week, the murmur had become a panicked roar. It was the Colorado potato beetle, a pest spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. They moved in a great, crawling wave, a silent, implacable army. They were voracious, capable of stripping a field of potato, tomato, and eggplant plants down to bare stalks in a matter of days. The valley fell into chaos. Farmers tried everything. They sent their children into the fields to pick the beetles off by hand, but for every 100 they collected, 1,000 more seemed to appear. Mr. Pritchard, his confidence shaken, spent a small fortune on the latest chemical pesticides from a catalogue, mixing the acrid powders in large barrels and spraying them across his vast fields. The poison killed thousands of beetles, but it also killed the beneficial insects, the bees, and the ladybugs. And still, the tide of beetles was too great. The air grew thick with the stench of chemicals and decaying plants. The green, vibrant valley began to turn brown. The wave of beetles eventually reached the 10 acres of Pritchard's folly. The sisters saw them coming, a shimmering, crawling carpet moving across the dusty ground. But they were ready. They moved all their chicken tractors to the perimeter of their farm, creating a living, feathered border. The beetles, driven by instinct, marched forward. As they crossed onto the sisters' land, they entered the domain of the chickens. The birds, unable to see the beetles' bright warning coloration that might have deterred a sighted predator, were guided by their other senses. They detected the vibration of thousands of tiny legs, the faint, acrid scent of the insects. They did not hesitate. They fell upon the beetles with the same methodical, focused intensity they applied to grubs. They ate, and ate, and ate. The first proof of their success was not a prize-winning cabbage or a perfectly formed carrot. It was a single, intact potato leaf. While the fields of their neighbors were being skeletonized, turned into ghostly lattices of vein and stalk, the plants on the sisters' farm remained lush and green. Their feathered army held the line. The first person to understand was not a farmer but a beekeeper. His name was Samuel, a quiet widower who lived alone in a small cabin a mile up the creek. Most of the town ignored him, considering him as eccentric as the sisters. Mr. Pritchard's pesticides had devastated his hives, the poison drifting on the wind and killing his bees by the thousands. He came to the sisters' farm one afternoon, drawn by a strange sight. The last of his surviving bees were congregating there, buzzing contentedly among the flowering squash and bin plants. He stood at the edge of their property for a long time, watching. He saw the chicken tractors. He saw the vibrant health of the plants. He saw the living, breathing system they had created. He was not a man of many words. He approached Abigail, who was mending a section of fence. "Your plants are clean," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "The chickens," she replied simply. Samuel nodded, his gaze sweeping over the flock. He was the first person in the valley who did not look at them with pity or scorn. He looked at them with the deep respect of one practitioner for another. He recognized the wisdom in their madness. He did not offer them help or advice. He offered an exchange. He taught them which wildflowers to cultivate to attract more pollinators, how to read the bees' behavior to predict changes in the weather. In return, they gave him sacks of potatoes and cabbages, food untouched by poison or pestilence. He was their first ally, a man who, like them, had been dismissed by the community, and who, like them, possessed a knowledge the community desperately needed. The community's conversion was not a grand, celebratory event. It was a slow, quiet surrender, driven not by admiration, but by hunger. The beetle plague had broken the valley's food supply. The shelves at the general store were growing bare. Mrs. Gable, the minister's wife, was the first to arrive. She came in the late afternoon, her face drawn and tight. Her own extensive kitchen garden was a wasteland. She did not praise their ingenuity. She did not apologize for her past dismissals. She simply asked, her voice low, What is the price for your potatoes? Martha met her gaze and named a fair price. Mrs. Gable paid without haggling, her need outweighing her pride. She left with a sack of potatoes and another of carrots. She was the first of many. They came one by one, then in small groups. The blacksmith, the storekeeper, families whose children were growing thin. They came for the food. They lined up at the edge of the property, their wagons and wheelbarrows waiting. Abigail and Martha sold what they could spare, their faces calm and unreadable. They did not gloat. They did not preach. They simply conducted the transactions, trading their miraculous harvest for the currency they needed to survive the winter. The laughter that had followed them from the town square had faded. In its place was a grudging, hungry silence. The day Mr. Pritchard came was a day like any other. The sun was hot, the air was still, and the chickens were tilling a new patch of ground. He did not arrive in his usual buckboard, pulled by his fine pair of horses. He walked. The dust of the road coated his boots and the cuffs of his trousers. He looked smaller than they remembered. The rigid certainty that had been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a deep, weary slump in his shoulders. The hardness in his eyes had not softened, it had crumbled. He looked like a man who had lost a war he hadn't known he was fighting. He stopped at the edge of the property, his gaze sweeping over the rows of vibrant green plants, the healthy, scratching chickens, the neat, orderly evidence of a system that worked. His own fields, visible in the distance, were a brown, barren testament to a system that had failed. He stood there for a long time, watching the sisters as they worked, harvesting heads of cabbage and tying them with twine. Finally, he approached. Abigail and Martha stopped their work and straightened up, waiting. He did not look them in the eye. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere over their shoulders. He did not offer an apology. He did not acknowledge his previous contempt. Men like Mr. Pritchard did not know those words. Instead, he made a request, his voice rough and low. "My family," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "We have little left to eat from our stores." The silence that followed was heavy with all the things that were not being said. It was a moment that could have been filled with bitterness, with righteous accusation. But the sisters had not been forged in that kind of fire. Theirs was a competence born of quiet observation, not of anger. They had been too busy surviving to cultivate grudges. Martha looked at Abigail. Abigail turned her calm, steady gaze to Mr. Pritchard. She did not ask him if he remembered his words in the town square. She did not ask him if he was sorry. She asked a simple, logistical question, the kind of question one practical farmer asks another. "How many are in your family?" "7," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. Abigail nodded. "We can spare 3 sacks of potatoes and a dozen cabbages. Can you carry that much?" He seemed stunned by the directness, the sheer practicality of the response. He nodded mutely. Martha went to the small root cellar and returned with the sacks and the cabbages. They handed them over. He took them, the weight of the food a palpable burden. He turned to leave, then hesitated. He looked back, and for the first time, his eyes met theirs. There was a universe of confusion and defeat in his gaze. But he said nothing more. He simply turned and began the long, dusty walk home. He returned 2 weeks later. The valley was in the slow, painful process of assessing its losses. Winter was coming, and many families were facing it with near-empty larders. Pritchard once again appeared on foot. This time, he carried something heavy in a canvas bag. He walked directly to where Abigail was reinforcing the wall of the chicken coop. He set the bag down with a metallic thud. He did not say thank you, he did not say I was wrong. Instead, he gestured toward their shallow, hand-dug well. "Your well is too shallow," he stated, his voice flat. "It will run dry in a hard winter." He opened the bag. Inside were the heavy iron gears and a linked chain for a proper well pump. "This should help you reach the deeper water." He turned and walked away before Abigail could form a response. It was not an apology, not in the way the world understands the word. It was something more valuable. It was an acknowledgement, a transfer of practical knowledge. It was a tool, not a sentiment. An admission of their success and his failure, delivered in the language of gears and iron. It was the only apology he was capable of giving, and the only one they needed. Years passed. The sisters' farm never grew large, and they never became wealthy. That was never their goal. Their farm became a place of quiet learning. They thrived. The well pump allowed them to plant a winter garden, producing hardy greens and root vegetables when other farms lay fallow. The chicken tractors became a fixture of the valley's landscape, as other, more open-minded farmers began to adopt their methods. They established a local seed bank, carefully saving the seeds from their hardiest plants and sharing them freely with anyone who asked. They taught anyone who came to them with honest questions, sharing the knowledge they had gleaned from their pamphlets and their own careful observations. They grew old together, their faces etched with the same lines carved by the same sun and wind. They died as they had lived, quietly and without ceremony. Abigail passed first, on a cool autumn morning, sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, a basket of beans she was shelling resting in her lap. The sun was warm on her face. Martha found her there, looking as though she had simply fallen asleep in the middle of a satisfying task. Martha followed her less than a year later, dying peacefully in her bed during a gentle spring rain. The sound of work from the neighboring farms, the farms they had helped to save, carried on the breeze through her open window. Their legacy was not written in books of history, but in the soil of the valley. Their method saved the community from 2 more blights over the next 30 years. They fed hundreds of families who would have otherwise gone hungry. The community they had once been outcasts from erected a single, shared headstone for them in the churchyard. The epitaph was carved from a simple piece of local fieldstone. It contained no scripture, no poetry. Just one short sentence that Samuel the beekeeper had suggested. It read, "They listened to the land." Perhaps you have an idea the world has called foolish. A blind chicken of your own that you've kept quiet in the back of your mind. You've been told it's a waste of time, that you are, in your own way, paying for your own ruin. You are standing outside a door that only your specific, peculiar key will fit, hesitant to turn it because the world has told you the room beyond is empty. But it is not empty. What is the ground telling you, if you would only stop long enough to listen? That drawing in their journal, of a beetle and a chicken's beak, was not a plan. It was a question. The world often mistakes quiet observation for foolishness. We tell stories of quiet competence every week. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.